Okay, boys, after our not quite convincing win against Wolverhampton Wanderers in the Carabao Cup, right, we only just got over the line, narrowly escaping with a one-goal lead, even though we headed into the, second half 3-0 up. I thought, what are some, takeaways we can take and hopefully look to either implement or improve upon for the Spurs game, right? So ultimately, what did we learn from that game, right? So there's some positives, some negatives, because, yes, we did win. But in typical Chelsea fashion, we almost threw it away, almost went to penalties, or whatever could have happened if that did happen. Especially with Jorgensen in goals. So I thought, let's have a look at and what can we really look to move forward, right? So in my opinion, I think this is our best wing pairing, right? I think Estevao and Gittins, they just kind of complement each other really well. You know, yes, in the bigger games, Maresca does tend to sort of favour either Garnacho and Neto, and I think that is acceptable. That is okay. I'm not totally against that, and we've got a squad. We need to use the players, right? We can't just let them sit on the bench. But I also think there's a manner in which you play them, right? And I don't want to see both of them play together. If we're going to use Neto on the right, fair enough, he's better on the right. Then I want to see Gittins on the left. I don't want to see Garnacho and Neto together. We just don't have much creativity there. Yes, we got some decent work rate. They're going to work for the team, right? But, unless Neto just puts his head down and runs like he does, maybe whips a cross in, yes, we might get a goal from that. But ultimately, I don't see, anything else they offer us. And, with Garnacho, yes, his pace behind the lines, is dangerous, especially against teams who are going to try to press us up the pitch, right? But I don't think you need both of them. We lose a lot of creativity. We lose a lot of our, sort of attacking threat as well. Like, I think Esteval's got 5 goals in his last 7 games. For an 18-year-old, is huge. And Gittins are just coming off, his best game in a Chelsea shirt against Wolves, right? 2 assists and got a great goal. I think we need to use that momentum, take that forward. Let's take a risk. I don't want us to be too safe. Let's go with these two wingers against Spurs. And if it doesn't work, we need to switch it up. Look, we can even be super proactive and do it at halftime. Or if Maresca wants to wait it out, maybe the 60th minute, we can change it up. Neto or Garnacho, warm up, get on the pitch. But, I want to see these two starting. Yes, we've got a small sample size, right? We've only seen them against Ajax and Wolves. But these are games we've scored a lot of goals in. So I think let's see it against, one of the big boys against Spurs on the weekend, and let's see what can happen, right? But I understand if we do need the balance in the squad. Look, if Garnacho wants to start on the left, I want to see Estevao on the right, or likewise, if Neto's starting, I want to see Gittins. I want some sort of balance, or moving on to the sort of point coming up as well. Maybe Estevao in the middle. Maresca did see kind of sees him as an inside player, so you never know. That could be on the table as well. I think the big main takeaway, especially the big negative one we can take, especially going into our next couple fixtures, they're getting harder. Especially we've got Barcelona coming up as well. But look, defensive issues, especially from set pieces. But Tosin and Chalobah, they're both in poor form. I'm not going to be one who's just going to hate on sort of Chalobah. He did have a decent start to the season. A lot of people were giving him his flowers, saying how well he's performed, how well he overcame being sort of on the bomb squad, going out on loan to Palace, being recalled. A lot of people were praising him, and quite rightly so. He was playing well, right? But at the moment, he's been at fault for a lot of goals, a lot of errors leading to goal. And it's the same with Tosin as well. Giving a penalty away, sloppy against Ajax when we were completely dominating them. It's like we don't need to be doing, yes, that didn't punish us in that game, but you saw with the Wolves one, if we give them a goal, yeah, all of a sudden the crowd start getting up for it. We've got such a young team and it's not the most physical team either. You can see once we maybe go, goal down or 2 goals down, even if we're winning, we look like we can crumble at any moment, right? And if we're doing that against Wolves, what are we going to be doing against the big teams, right? And I think, the big issue as well is we didn't, identify and find some sort of solution for Levi Colwell and his season long injury, right? Obviously, Maresca made it public he wanted a replacement. The board said no, we've got internal solutions. And you're like, yes, that made, a pathway for a champion. Don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of a champion, huge player. But he's not a left centre back. He's not left footed, and yes, he's a centre back, but he's a different sort of position, right? And I think, yes, we got Badger Shield who can play there, and when he's fit, he's a good defender. Don't get me wrong, but the guy can't stay fit. He's made of glass, and it's the same with Fofana, right? So I think Maresca's got to find some sort of solution, especially with our set pieces defensively. If a Champyong is going to be, the main sort of centre back this season, because I think he's been, he's played the best, he's performed the best, so he deserves to start, right? Who's going to partner him? Because we've seen him with Tosin, we've seen him with Chalobah. Neither of them have looked very good next to him either. Maybe Joel Hatto is going to be the solution, but again, that's a very young centre-back partnership, and we're sort of relying on Reece James and Cucurella to be the experienced ones at the back, and they're not even old, and they're not centre-backs either. So it's looking like, we definitely made a mistake in the transfer window. We should have got a left-footed centre-back, at least someone who can fill in for Levi Colwill, even if it was on loan, just some sort of solution, right? I didn't realise my camera is blocking some of the stats. No, I don't want to move that. Okay, if I move myself over here, you can kind of see the statistics here. So look, 6.10 XG conceded from set pieces first. So, what's that telling us? We absolutely cannot defend set pieces, whether that be a corner, a dead ball situation, a long throw in, which a lot of teams are starting to implement now. We can't defend them, especially we saw it in the Wolves game. Any little flick-ons, any sort of, calamity drama in the box, we just kind of shit ourselves, right? And we allow, physical strikers or defenders to get in there and impose themselves upon us. And I think you think of Chelsea of old as well. We've normally had those physical, defenders or a physical team. And right now that is the biggest problem. We just absolutely cannot defend ourselves on set pieces. So we've got to find some sort of solution. And ironically, we've been really good offensively from set pieces as well. It's just the defensive side of the game, we absolutely cannot do it, right? Look, 45% XG conceded from set pieces, which also tells us we're quite hard to break down and play through the middle in the actual game, right? But as long as you get a corner, as long as you get a free kick, as long as you get a long throw in, you're going to cause us problems, and that's a big issue, of course. 40% of shots conceded come from set pieces, and 0.14 XG per shot conceded. So the chances we do give people are really big, and a lot of them have been errors leading to goal as well, either passing it to them or, sloppy passes out from the back, not being switched on enough, or, losing our composure as the game goes on. There's a lot of issues. The Wolves one definitely sort of highlighted that as well. And I think moving on to take, what can we learn from that game and move on to the Spurs game and obviously further into our season, we need to find someone who can work with a champion. So whether that's going to be Fofana, if he can stay fit, but again, we lose a bit of balance. They're not, a natural left-sided centre-back, unless we primarily utilise Cucurella as that left-sided centre-back and stop him from going forward, and maybe Reece James has to maybe tuck into midfield. I don't know what the solution is. We'll leave it up to Maresca, right? He's getting the big bucks, but, there's certainly a lot of issues, and we gotta look to rectify them for sure. Obviously, the number 10 position. Now, especially the Carabao Cup, and you saw some of the other games that are, quote unquote, easier. Buonanotte has started in the number 10 position. Now, he's not been totally convincing. I think he looks like an okay player, right? But I think you need to be a lot more than just an okay player, especially if you want to play for Chelsea. I just don't see him, really developing and just cracking down that number 10 position. He is a number 10, but when you're looking at sort of some of the names we could have got in the summer, whether it be Xavi Simons, and I know he's not come into the Spurs team and looked amazing. But again, it's the same with, Fermin Lopez. I think we were looking at that sort of caliber of number 10, right? And we go out and get, a backup at Brighton on loan. It just doesn't quite make sense. And I think we're seeing that this season. He looks okay, but he's certainly not banging in goals. And especially, this is with Palmer being injured. You think, okay, João Pedro, what position is he? Is he a number 10? Is he a number, a number 9? He's sort of like a 9.5 almost, right? Maybe a second striker, shadow striker, whatever you want to call it. But I don't know. Like, he's in quite poor form at the moment. I still see him as a number 10, right? And maybe once Palmer comes back, he plays that right wing position. But then how does Estevao get into the team? How does maybe Neto get into the team, right? You're seeing a few issues here. So it kind of means João Pedro has to play number 9. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for him to get into squad and other players to get into the squad. And, you know, if Palmer, say his groin is a bigger injury as well, because we've got Buonanotte on loan, we can't exactly go into the January transfer market and go out and buy someone, right? Because, then Brighton might recall him or whatever, right? So, again, the squad planning looks a bit off. We're seeing that in these sort of games as well. And I don't know what kind of the long-term solution is, right? For the Spurs game, Delap misses out. So, I assume Mark Guay is going to be starting at striker. João Pedro is going to be playing in that number 10 position. And then, I'd like Estevao to be on the right. But, João Pedro's definitely in a bit of poor form. We didn't see that against Wolves. Obviously, he didn't play. But Buonanotte certainly doesn't look like the solution, right? He doesn't look like the player who's going to come in, make us start ticking. And, yes, he works okay for the team. I thought, he definitely hustled in the Wolves game, right? But, again, what happens once Palmer's back? It looks like he's just going to sit on the bench and, we could have gone out there and we could have signed someone maybe more for the long term. So, definitely some sort of issue to look at there. But it's not all negative. I think the last point we can take from the Wolves game was Lavia and that sort of position he played as well. I think we certainly saw when Lavia was substituted off in the 60th minute, we did kind of collapse. We lost a bit of our defensive stability, right? And they were being a lot more aggressive and being able to play through us a bit more. But once we had Lavia there, he's so press proven and he was playing really deep, right? He was almost, if you looked in possession, he was almost that sort of central centre back receiving the ball. And then the Wolves players didn't know, should we press him? So should we sit off? And he was able to just play through the middle, and that was opening up the Wolves team, right? And that's how we got those 3 goals quite early on in the game as well. All from him dropping deep on the ball, a nice progressive pass into the middle, and then either Andre Santos or Buonanotte would sort of receive it on the half turn, play it out wide, and then Gittins was obviously cooking, and so was Estevao. So we just sort of get it to the wingers and let them do their thing, and that's why I want to see those two playing in the future, and they need to be the main starters for me because that's how we get the most offensively out of them. But, back to Lavia, he hasn't been injured for a while. This has been the longest Lavia's been fit for a very long time. Normally this guy plays against Liverpool and then he's injured and we don't see him for another 3 months and then he's back for Liverpool again, right? So does Maresca maybe try and find a way of getting him into the team? And, with the last point as well, with our sort of number 10 dilemma, is potentially Lavia that solution? Now, not to say he's playing number 10, but maybe we just go with a 4-3-3 and we just go maybe Lavia as that sort of deep lying playmaker. He's going to play as that classic number 6, right? And then Caicedo can sort of be that box-to-box ball winner kind of midfielder, a bit, more progressive, maybe as an 8. And then that allows for Enzo Fernandez to have, less defensive responsibility because he can do the job, but, that's not his main attributes. We get a lot more out of him if he's box crashing or certainly being involved in the final third, right? So potentially this could also be the solution. Now, we could also see maybe Reece James as just a sort of, right-sided centre-back. Caicedo starts as a right-back but inverts into midfield. We've seen that a couple times this season and last season, right? Which would allow for Lavia and Enzo to start, especially, with Caicedo inverting into midfield. But it just means Reece James is going to have to stay as that sort of central or right-sided centre-back. I don't know if that's the sort of how we get the best out of Reece James, right? So how do we move forward? I think Lavia is almost too good to maybe just sit on the bench, especially, the defensive stability he brings us. And if we're going to be leaking goals, we need players who are going to stop us from leaking goals ultimately, right? So, we saw once he got subbed off, we looked shaky. We didn't quite have, Andre Santos and Enzo Fernandez isn't quite defensive enough. And then you saw that, Caicedo had to come on and play the sort of last 10 minutes, which is not something he probably wanted to do, right? So those are the sort of 4 things I think we learned from the Wolves game. Look, match preview is coming out tomorrow. We play Spurs on Saturday, so it's a quick turnaround again. But I think we need to, look definitely, the sort of big blaring problem that's staring right at us is how poor defensively on set pieces we are. So we need to fix that. It's not going to be a quick sort of fix. We're going to have to start, slowly implementing things, but I think it's going to start with who's the best pairing for a champion. Can they stay fit? They need to start playing, right? So those are the takeaways from the game, boys. See you tomorrow with the match preview and, big game on the weekend. So up the Chels. Peace.